A while back, I did an interview on the De facto Leaders podcast with Eric McKelkey, a principal from Wyoming, on the topic of employee evaluations in K-12 education. This is a hot topic among related service providers as well as principals, so I wanted to talk about it because I know that this could be equally frustrating for all people involved. So the issue that comes up is that the person doing the evaluation in K-12 education has often not done the jobs of all the people that they are evaluating. And so this can be equally frustrating for both the person being evaluating as well as the person doing the evaluation. I know that when I've talked to principals and they've shared that they have to evaluate a nurse, for example, or a speech pathologist or a social worker, and they've never been in that role, that can be really challenging and uncomfortable for them to know how to give feedback that's useful. And then I know from being in that related service provider role and talking to other people who are therapists and in those clinical roles, it can be frustrating for them as well because they want feedback from somebody who is in their specific discipline on certain therapy techniques. So what I wanted to do today is talk about why this is happening, and then in the future I'm going to talk about some options for what we can do about it. So why is this happening? Well, there's a big shortage of school administrators. I know that this is true in my state. I'm in Illinois, and this is true in other areas of the United States as well. So whether it's principals, superintendents, special ed directors, there's a need for people in those roles that are responsible for evaluating staff. And as a result, it gets hard to find people that are related to the disciplines that they're evaluating. And a lot of times they just have to assign those people to whoever is available. A lot of times that means that maybe a building principal is evaluating someone who is in a very specific special ed role instead of a special ed director or somebody who is in that specific clinical role themselves. So again, as I said, that can be kind of frustrating, but this often happens, especially at smaller districts where there's just fewer administrators, and the administrators that are there wear more hats. There's not the same chain of command as there are in those bigger districts. It can be really hard to appoint a specific department head for each area because there's just not as many people. So that's partly why it happens. Now, sometimes what can happen, this happens a little bit more in bigger districts, but I've seen it happen in smaller districts as well, is that there might be somebody who is kind of emerges into a leadership role, into kind of a pseudo administrative role that kind of turns into a leadership role. So maybe they're kind of a department head or they're a hybrid coordinator. So I've seen in speech pathology, there's kind of a speech coordinator or supervisor who is responsible for providing some mentorship and leadership for the speech pathologist, for example. And sometimes the people that end up in those roles don't have their administrator credential. So the problem that happens there is that, and again, this kind of depends on how things are set up in the district and the state, but I know that in the state of Illinois, if in order for someone to do staff evaluations, they have to have their administrative credential. So if there are people who kind of go into these administrative roles that aren't official administrative roles, then they can't technically evaluate staff. They have to be reporting to someone else. So yes, there might be someone who's kind of a peer or a supervisor that can give you feedback, but they're not the official one doing your evaluation. You still might be officially evaluated by someone who hasn't held your job title before. As I said, that's very frustrating. Now, I don't think that this problem is ever going to go away completely because it's not reasonable to expect districts to be able to find an administrator that has done all the different jobs of the people that they supervise. That person simply doesn't exist. And this doesn't just happen in the specific clinical areas. A building principal, for example, has not taught all the different subject areas of all the teaching staff even. So this isn't specific to the clinical fields. It happens everywhere in education and really in other industries as well. So the question is, what do we do about this, and how can we make this useful? Well, I wanted to answer those questions in some future videos, but right now. If you want to learn more about this topic and how you can make your employee evaluations useful to you, even if the person that's evaluating you has never held the role that you currently have, then check out De Facto Leaders Podcast, episode 109. So in this episode, we share that, again, this interview is with Eric McKelkey, who is a principal who has really had that experience of having to evaluate all different kinds of staff, especially staff that have been in roles that he hadn't done himself. So if you want to get that perspective and understand what your building administrator might be looking for, how can you make that a good experience for both of you, definitely check out that interview. Again, that's De Facto Leaders Podcast, episode 109 with Eric McKelkey.